Ellie, thank you so much for being with us
Thank you
today.
so much
Thank
for
you for
having me.
sharing your story with us.
Absolutely.
Let's start by talking about your movie.
Oh, it's called A Lot Like You,
Uh-huh.
and the idea for it came about when my partner Tom and I were starting to think about having kids. And my father is Tanzanian, my mother's Korean. So I grew up in a very mixed household, and now my partner is Irish and Portuguese. And so I was, when I started thinking about our kids and how I was going to pass on this Chaga culture piece, my dad's piece, the Tanzanian side of my family, I struggled with how am I supposed to pass on what it means to be Chaga to my kids when it feels so hazy to me. And so I had the idea of going off and making this film. And at the time, I'd been working, doing domestic violence and sexual assault crisis counseling work for about 12 years. And also coincidentally at the time, my dad had just retired and was moving back to Tanzania for good. So I thought it was a great opportunity to follow him with a camera and film his journey back to reconnect with the family and culture that he left behind 40 years earlier.
And you went to Tanzania
Yep.
with your partner.
Yep.
How long did you spend there shooting this film?
We went back the beginning of 2004 and we were there for 9 months filming. Mostly on Mount Kilimanjaro.
Uh-huh.
And we were on the same coffee farm where my dad was born and raised, which is where he moved back to with my mom. And we were just immersed in the village life, in Chaga culture, and trying to unpack this world that my dad had left behind when he was 18.
You are of mixed heritage,
Right.
Tanzanian and Korean, and apparently, you said to me earlier, you grew up with your mom's Korean family around you.
Right.
So you were seeking your dad's story.
Right, right.
What was it about that surprised you?
Well, I had grown up going back to Tanzania every other summer. So, in one sense, it was very familiar surroundings that I was returning to. The farmhouse, Kilimanjaro, being on the mountain, the family, they were all familiar to me, but I'd never actually sat down and really heard their stories. And I wanted to get stories about growing up and what it was like. I thought this would be a great way for me to take this most remote part of our family, the Tanzanian part, and bring it to my kids. Bring it to life for my kids, And so I sat down and I started asking them questions, mostly, what did you guys do when you were kids? Did you get in trouble? What was it like growing up? What were your rites of passage? And as I asked more and more questions, the information that was coming out was really surprising. First of all, it's a very private culture. So it took a lot of chipping away to get at the stories. And once the stories started coming out, it was hard to stop, and it was not what I was expecting. So in some of the conversations with the siblings, we got the siblings together.
Your dad's siblings?
My dad's siblings. My dad's the youngest of 6. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to get a lot of dirt on my dad this way. You know what I mean? And they were very, very close-mouthed. They played everything very close to the chest. But the women kind of took this opportunity to share their own personal truths. And they were truths that I was not expecting to hear. I did not fully understand that it was part of my culture. So I talked to them as a group, and then I interviewed them one-on-one, and I talked to the women on their own. They're 2 sisters. And in those interviews, they were telling me stories about their rites of passage, which include circumcision or female genital mutilation, depending on how you look at it. And the intention behind it being to control the sexuality of women. And so that was, and they went into great detail about what that looked like and what it felt like, and the consequences if they showed any sign of pain, if they flinched, that their father had to pay a fine in the price of a goat. It was...
And they're 12 years old.
And they're 12 years old
when
this is happening. Yeah, 12, 13 when this is happening. And then, so that, like I was saying earlier, would have been enough for me to have to process, because it was very intense to hear them tell these stories. And then they started telling me stories about once women were circumcised, they were then ready to go ahead and get married. And in the conversation with my aunts, they were sharing with me stuff that they never shared even with each other. And I mean, it's important to know everyone is growing up within walking distance of each other.
Right. They see these people their entire lives.
All the time. And the stuff that they were choosing to share with me in front of the camera was stuff that they never even shared with each other. And a lot of it had to do with how they got married.
How was that?
Some of this, okay, let me think. It was, even though a lot of them had suitors, they had men that they were interested in dating, they were romantically linked to, just about all of the women we talked to described having the experience of being kidnapped, sometimes by more than one man, carried back to somebody's home, and raped. And that is how they entered into the institution of marriage. They were, the person who sexually assaulted them was the person who had the right, who had claimed them, and they were then, that was the betrothal. They were married. They had to be married to that man.
How did they accept that? Do they accept that as an appropriate part of life? Or is it something you sensed that they resented? How did they handle that within themselves?
From the conversations that I was having with the women and the men about how they got married, the men were all very stoic. They had very vague stories. They were all kind of a little bit vague and confused as to how they actually got married. And all the women chose to share with me in that moment with the cameras on, the lights blaring, the truth of their stories. So I felt like there was sort of like a bubbling and uprising of women who definitely felt like it was a harm against their humanity, and this was their opportunity to bring to light this thing that had been kept a secret within our culture for so long.
Wow.
And it was happening completely in isolation. It's not like these women were talking to each other. So I talked to my aunts. They both independently of each other chose to share these stories with me. And then other elder women in the village. Every time I sat down and I talked to them, I talked to about 11 women. 10 of them had their own version of this horrible story that they were choosing to share with me. And I was a little bit surprised because in a lot of other efforts that I was making to make a film about Tanzanian culture, I was getting very surface stuff. Stuff that I think maybe I was going in with an expectation of what I wanted to see, and people were performing the brand of Chaga culture they thought I was wanting to see as an American tourist. So the thought that like all of these women at this particular moment in time were choosing to share the truth of their story with me was very powerful.
How, if at all, did this shift the focus of your film? How could it not?
How could it not? Especially given that this is the lens that I bring to the world. This is the work that I've been doing. I have my own personal experiences with this.
Right.
This is who I am. This is what I bring to the party. Like, so the fact that this degree of abuse and trauma could have been in my family, this degree of gender violence could have been so overtly practiced in my own family, and that I had no inkling of it, was shocking to me. And so I, since we've been back, we've been working on editing and finding the story, and this has been the one piece that I've refused to let go of. Like, I have to be a good steward of these stories, and I have to do what I can to just bring an awareness of this part of our culture. And it's hard because there's a lot of resistance.
Well, sure.
There's a lot of resistance, right? And so I just needed to, so it actually has, the fact that these women told these stories to me and not to my dad meant that I had to be in the film. The film that I thought was going to be about my dad and returning back to Tanzania and how struggles to fit back in. Now I had these stories, and I needed to figure out, like, what was my responsibility to these women and their stories. I had to be in the film because I was the holder of these stories. And so then it's been this juggling act to figure out my dad's story, my story. Where does one end and the other one begin? And so what the story we're ending up with now is one where these women's stories are actually centered.
So what started as a story of seeking racial identity has morphed into a story of misogyny.
Right.
What do you see as you go through this process as a more powerfully destructive force, racism or misogyny?
That's a very intense question. I mean, I think in the context of this story, it has ended up being about, and this isn't to imply that one is more or less harmful, but the story has evolved into one that looks at the cost of gender violence on a whole community. And that's part of where the title "A Lot Like You" comes in, you know, because as I was growing up, when I was younger, I felt this resentment coming at me that felt directed at me from my aunts. Like they would look at me, the Chaga women, like they looked at me and they resented me in this way that, and I experienced them as resenting me. Like it was what I felt. It wasn't,
right.
I don't know if that was actually their intention, but that's how I felt, that it was directed at me. And after hearing their stories, I can totally understand where that's coming from. The thing that's ironic is that I have my own personal experiences that are rooted in the same oppression, that are rooted in the same need to exercise power and control, like that are rooted in the same fundamental experience. That actually we find the most unlikely connections with people sometimes through our most painful experiences, and that has ended up being the message in this film. Is despite the fact that we've grown up worlds apart, that ultimately our experiences are not that different.
A lot like you.
Yeah.
Misogyny is not necessarily exclusive to third world countries.
No, actually.
What a surprise.
Right. And one thing that I do know from doing this work is that, you know, in the U.S., there were no laws against raping and beating your wife until about the late 60s, early 70s. So it's not like we were that far ahead of the game. And it's not like once we got those laws on the books that took care of misogyny and sexism, right? So it's an acknowledgement that it's a harm against a people. And so, but you know, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting that sort of same recognition in Tanzania with Chaga women, but it's a start. And getting these stories out there is a start.
How will you, or have you thought about how you're going to bring balance to the story of the Tanzanian culture now, of the Chaga culture, when this particular portion of the culture has become so prominent in your view?
Right.
How will you bring balance, or have you decided it doesn't matter?
You know, that's something that I'm struggling with. I think that's something I'm struggling with, and when I've been having conversations with my dad after like seeing the most recent cut of the film, it's something that he's been struggling with too. Is every culture has aspects about it that are shameful, that don't show the culture in the best possible light, and this is such a unique opportunity to be sharing with the world Chaga culture, not just brutal aspects that are embarrassing and shameful, but also the beauty of the culture. And I think that's going to come across in the film, because we go on a search for Chaga culture, and we find, and there's a lot of, as heavy and intense and deep as these conversations are that we're having about the film, there are parts about it that are fun and funny and delightful and beautiful. And so it's really about me going back to Tanzania and discovering both the beauty and the brutality of the culture that my dad left behind, so that when I'm passing something on to my daughter, it is the full picture. And when she tries to figure out what it means for her to be Chaga, she has the full array of culture that I've been able to amass in my own exploration. I have that to hand over to her. And she may love me for doing some of the search for her. She may really be angry at me for what I'm putting out into the world. I don't know. She's only 3.
Well,
but at least she'll be making an informed decision about the parts of Chaga culture that she chooses to take on for herself.
I don't know how she could, whatever she decides, miss the point that her mom took a very honorable and sincere journey to give her the depth of her heritage. Eliaichi Kimaro, thank you so much for being with us.